The rain was coming down in sheets when my son Daniel told me to get out of his car 3 blocks from the Rolls-Royce dealership. Gas is expensive, Mom. You can walk the rest of the way. What happened next at that dealership changed everything, and Daniel's face when he realized what he'd done will stay with me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and at 72, I thought I understood humiliation. I was wrong. Real humiliation isn't slipping on ice in front of the grocery store or forgetting someone's name at church. Real humiliation is your own child treating you like a burden so heavy that saving $3 in gas money matters more than your dignity. It was a Thursday in October when my world shifted on its axis, though I didn't know it at the time. The autumn rain had been falling since dawn, turning the streets of Millbrook into rivers and making everything look gray and miserable. I had been living with Daniel and his wife Patricia for 8 months since my husband Edmund passed away, and every day felt like walking on eggshells. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what to do with the big house on Elm Street that Edmund and I had called home for 43 years. But temporary had stretched into months, and I could feel their patience wearing thin. Little comments about my habits, my belongings taking up space, my tendency to watch the news too loudly. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, less of an imposition. Daniel worked as a middle manager at an insurance company, the kind of job that paid the bills but never quite enough to feel secure. Patricia taught elementary school and complained constantly about the low pay and demanding parents. They lived paycheck to paycheck in their modest ranch house, and my presence had clearly strained their budget. They never said it directly, but I could see it in the way Patricia counted grocery items twice, and how Daniel's jaw tightened when I asked for rides anywhere. I had been putting off dealing with my late husband's classic car collection for months. Edmund had been passionate about vintage automobiles, spending his retirement years restoring 3 beautiful machines that sat in our old garage like sleeping giants. A 1965 Shelby Cobra, a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda, and his pride and joy, a 1973 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow that he had spent 5 years bringing back to perfect condition. The cars were valuable, I knew that much, but Edmund had always handled such matters. I felt overwhelmed by the thought of dealing with dealers and appraisers, and all the paperwork that would be involved. Daniel had been pushing me for weeks to get rid of Dad's old cars, so we could finally move forward. He made it sound like keeping them was somehow preventing me from healing, when the truth was they were one of the few connections I still had to my late husband. That morning, Daniel had grudgingly agreed to drive me to Premier Auto Collections, a high-end dealership that specialized in classic and luxury vehicles. I had called them the day before, and they had sounded professional and knowledgeable. The appointment was set for 2 o'clock, and I had been nervously preparing for it all week. Patricia had made it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. Eleanor, those cars are just sitting there collecting dust and costing money in insurance. You need to be practical about this. Daniel and I can't keep supporting you indefinitely. Her words stung because there was truth in them. I did feel like a burden, and I did worry about money, though I tried not to show it. The rain started just as we were getting ready to leave. Daniel stood by the front door, checking his phone and sighing dramatically while I gathered my purse and the folder of paperwork related to the cars. I had Edmund's insurance documents, registration papers, and a few photographs of the vehicles in their restored state. Come on, Mom. We need to get going. I have a conference call at 3:30 that I can't miss. Daniel's voice carried that particular tone of strained patience that had become his default when speaking to me. I hurried as fast as my arthritis would allow, pulling on my raincoat and grabbing my umbrella. The drive to the dealership started quietly enough. Daniel navigated the wet streets with the radio playing softly, and I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods of Millbrook. I had lived in this town for over 4 decades, had raised Daniel here, had built a life with Edmund here. Now it all felt foreign somehow, like I was seeing it through the eyes of a stranger. You know, Mom, Daniel said as we stopped at a red light, you really should consider selling the house too. The property taxes alone are killing you, and the maintenance costs are only going to get worse. Patricia and I have been talking, and we think it would be better for everyone if you moved into one of those senior living communities. My stomach clenched. We had had this conversation before, and it never got easier. The house is paid off, Daniel. And it's my home. Your father and I, Dad's gone, Mom. His voice was sharper than he probably intended. You can't live in the past forever. You need to think about your future, about what's practical. I fell silent, staring at my hands folded in my lap. The wedding ring Edmund had placed there 51 years ago caught the gray light from the window. Practical. Everything had to be practical now. There was no room for sentiment or memory, or the simple desire to hold on to pieces of the life I had built. As we approached the downtown area where Premier Auto Collections was located, the rain intensified. Daniel turned down a side street, and I assumed he was taking a different route to avoid traffic. But then he pulled over to the curb 3 blocks away from our destination and put the car in park. "This is as far as I go," he said, not looking at me. "Gas prices are insane right now, and I've already used more than I budgeted for this week driving you around." I stared at him in disbelief. "Daniel, it's pouring rain. The dealership is 3 blocks away. You have an umbrella. It's not that far." He was scrolling through his phone, already dismissing me. "I'll pick you up here when you're done. Just call me when you're ready." The dismissal in his voice hit me like a physical blow. This was my son, the baby I had nursed through countless illnesses, the child I had cheered for at every soccer game and school play. The young man I had been so proud of when he graduated college, when he got married, when he bought his first house, and now he couldn't spare $3 in gas money to drive his elderly mother to an important appointment in a downpour. "Daniel, please, I'm 72 years old. I can't walk 3 blocks in this rain." He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was indifference. "Mom, you need to stop being so helpless. You're not that old, and a little rain never hurt anyone. I'll be waiting right here when you're done." I sat there for a moment, rain drumming on the roof of the car, trying to process what was happening. Part of me wanted to argue, to demand that he drive me the remaining distance. But I could see the set of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel. This was the man who had once told me I was the strongest person he knew. Now he saw me as nothing but an inconvenience. I opened the car door and stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through my coat despite the umbrella, and the wind nearly turned it inside out. I heard Daniel's car door slam shut behind me, and when I turned back, he was already on his phone, not even watching to make sure I made it safely to the sidewalk. The walk to Premier Auto Collections was one of the longest of my life. Each step felt like a small defeat, a confirmation that I had become exactly what I feared most, a burden that even my own son couldn't bear. My shoes were soaked within the first block, and my arthritis ached with each step on the uneven sidewalk. Cars splashed by, their occupants warm and dry, and I felt utterly alone in the world. By the time I reached the dealership, I was drenched and shivering. The building was impressive, all glass and chrome with luxury vehicles gleaming under the showroom lights. I stood outside for a moment, trying to compose myself, and wondering if I should just turn around and walk back to where Daniel was waiting. I probably looked like a drowned rat, hardly the kind of customer they would take seriously. But something in me, maybe the last remnant of pride I had left, made me push through the glass doors into the warm, elegant interior. The showroom was stunning, filled with pristine classic cars and modern luxury vehicles that probably cost more than most people made in a year. The floors were polished marble, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. A well-dressed man in his 50s approached me immediately, his face showing concern rather than the judgment I had expected. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested he was someone important here, not just a salesperson. "Ma'am, are you all right? You look like you've been through quite an ordeal." His voice was warm and genuinely concerned. "Here, let me get you a towel and some coffee. I'm Richard Blackwood, the owner of Premier Auto Collections." I was surprised that the owner himself was greeting me, and even more surprised by his kindness. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I have a 2 o'clock appointment about some classic cars I need to sell." His face lit up with recognition. "Mrs. Hartwell, yes, we spoke yesterday. Please don't worry about being a little wet. These things happen. Let me get you something warm to drink, and we'll get you dried off before we talk business." He led me to a comfortable seating area near a fireplace, something I hadn't expected to find in a car dealership. A young woman appeared with a soft towel and a steaming cup of coffee, and I felt human again for the first time in hours. Richard sat across from me, his attention completely focused on me, as if I were the most important person in the world. "Now then," he said, settling back in his chair, "tell me about your husband's collection. From what you described on the phone, it sounds like he had excellent taste in automobiles." For the next hour, I found myself talking about Edmund, in a way I hadn't been able to since his death. Richard listened with genuine interest as I described my husband's passion for restoration, his meticulous attention to detail, and the joy he had found in bringing these beautiful machines back to life. I showed him the photographs I had brought, and his eyes widened with appreciation. "Mrs. Hartwell, your husband was clearly a master craftsman. These restorations are absolutely museum quality. The Shelby Cobra alone is worth serious money, but this Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow," he paused, studying the photograph more closely. "This is exceptional work." I can see why he was so proud of it. Something in his tone made me look up from my coffee. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you something, and please forgive me if this seems presumptuous. Do you have any idea what these cars are actually worth?" I shook my head, feeling suddenly nervous. Edmund always said they were valuable, but I never paid much attention to the details. "I know they're worth something, but I'm not sure how much." Richard was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell, based on what you've shown me and described, I believe your husband's collection is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. Possibly more, depending on the exact condition and provenance." The coffee cup slipped from my hands, clattering against the saucer. $800,000. I stared at Richard, certain I had misheard him. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" $800,000, minimum. The Rolls-Royce alone, if it's in the condition these photographs suggest, could be worth $350,000. The Shelby Cobra is probably worth $400,000. And the Barracuda, well, that depends on the specific model and options, but I'd estimate at least $50,000. I felt dizzy. All these months of feeling like a burden, of listening to Daniel and Patricia talk about money troubles and my expensive needs, and I had been sitting on a fortune. Edmund had never told me the specific values, had always just said they were worth keeping. I realized now that he had been protecting me from something, though I wasn't sure what. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you all right? You look pale." "I had no idea," I whispered. "My son, he's been telling me I need to sell everything, that I can't afford to maintain my lifestyle. I thought maybe the cars might bring in a few $1,000s, enough to help with expenses for a while." Richard's expression grew thoughtful. "May I ask about your living situation? You mentioned your son yesterday, I believe." Something in his tone made me look up sharply. "I'm living with him and his wife temporarily. Since my husband passed away, they've been very accommodating." I see. Richard was quiet for a moment, and I had the distinct impression he was thinking about something important. "Mrs. Hartwell, forgive me for asking, but do they know you're here today? Do they know about the potential value of these cars?" "Daniel drove me here actually. Well, partway here." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, as I remembered the humiliating ride and walk in the rain. "He's waiting for me a few blocks away." Richard's eyebrows rose. "He didn't come in with you, in this weather?" The kindness in his voice almost made me cry. Here was a complete stranger, showing more concern for my well-being than my own son had. He said gas was expensive, that I could walk the rest of the way. For a moment Richard's professional composure slipped, and I saw a flash of something that looked like anger cross his face. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but any son who would make his elderly mother walk 3 blocks in a thunderstorm to save a few dollars in gas money is not thinking clearly about priorities." I felt tears threatening, and tried to blink them back. "He's been under a lot of stress. Money's been tight since I moved in with them." "Mrs. Hartwell, if these cars are worth what I think they are, money should be the last thing you need to worry about. But before we go any further, I think we need to have your vehicles properly appraised. I'd like to come out and see them in person, if that's all right with you." "Of course, but I should warn you, they've been sitting in the garage for months. I'm not sure what condition they're in now." Classic cars are remarkably resilient, if they're stored properly. And from what you've told me about your husband's care, I suspect they're in better condition than you think. Richard stood up, his dick-is-chin clearly made. Mrs. Hartwell, would you allow me to drive you home? I'd like to see the cars today if possible. And frankly, I don't like the idea of you walking back to your son's car in this weather. The relief I felt was overwhelming.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
That would be wonderful, thank you. But what about Daniel? He's expecting to pick me up. We'll call him and let him know you have a ride. Don't worry about that. As Richard led me toward the back of the showroom, I caught sight of myself in one of the mirrors mounted on a pillar. I looked small and bedraggled, my gray hair still damp from the rain and my clothes wrinkled from the walk. But there was something different in my eyes, a spark that I hadn't seen in months. For the first time since Edmund's death, I felt like I mattered to someone. Richard's car was a beautiful black Bentley that felt like riding in a cloud. As we drove through the rainy streets of Millbrook, he asked thoughtful questions about my life with Edmund, about the years we had spent together, about the house we had shared. I found myself opening up to him in a way that surprised me, telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone since my husband's death. Your husband sounds like he was a remarkable man, Richard said as we pulled into my driveway on Elm Street. And from everything you've told me, he was very much in love with you. We had a good life together, I said softly, looking up at the house that had been my home for so many years. He took care of everything. Sometimes I think he took care of things too well, because now I feel so lost without him. Mrs. Hartwell, may I share something with you? In my business I meet a lot of people who are dealing with estates and family transitions. What I've learned is that grief can make us forget our own strength. Your husband may have handled the practical matters, but he couldn't have built the life you shared without a strong partner. We sat in his car for a moment, looking at the garage where Edmund's cars waited. The rain had finally stopped, and weak afternoon sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. Would you like to see them now? I asked. I would be honored. I led Richard around to the side of the house where the old detached garage stood. Edmund had upgraded the electrical system and installed climate control to protect his precious automobiles. My hands shook slightly as I unlocked the door and reached for the light switch. The 3 cars sat exactly as Edmund had left them, covered with custom car covers and arranged with military precision. Even under the covers, their shapes were elegant and purposeful. Richard walked around each vehicle slowly, his experienced eye taking in details I couldn't see. Mrs. Hartwell, would you mind if I take a look under these covers? Please go ahead. I watched as Richard carefully lifted the cover from the Rolls-Royce, and I heard him draw in a sharp breath. The car was magnificent, its silver paint gleaming even in the dim garage light. Every detail was perfect, from the polished chrome to the spotless interior visible through the windows. My God, Richard whispered. Mrs. Hartwell, this is extraordinary. This isn't just a restoration, it's a work of art. He moved to the Shelby Cobra next, and his reaction was even stronger. The bright blue sports car looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line, every line and curve speaking of power and precision. This is a 1965 Shelby Cobra, 427, isn't it? He asked, his voice full of awe. I think so. Edmund always said it was his most challenging restoration. Mrs. Hartwell, there are fewer than 1,000 of these ever made. In this condition, this car alone could bring $450,000 at auction. I felt my knees go weak. $450,000 for one car. The numbers were so large they didn't seem real. Richard uncovered the Plymouth Barracuda last, revealing a stunning muscle car in deep purple with black racing stripes. 1970 Plymouth Cuda 446 pack, he said, running his hand along the fender. Your husband had incredible taste. This is a perfect example of American muscle. We stood in the garage for nearly an hour, while Richard examined each car in detail. He took photographs with his phone, made notes in a small leather journal, and asked me questions about maintenance records and documentation. Throughout it all, his respect for Edmund's work was evident. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to be completely honest with you. This collection is worth significantly more than I estimated in my office. We're looking at well over $1 million, possibly closer to 1.25 million. I had to sit down on an old workbench, the magnitude of what he was telling me finally sinking in. $1.25 million. I was not poor. I was not a burden. I was a woman of considerable means who had been made to feel like a charity case. I don't understand, I said quietly. If Edmund knew these were worth so much, why didn't he ever tell me? Why did he let me worry about money? Richard sat down beside me on the workbench, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Hartwell, in my experience, men of your husband's generation often protected their wives from financial details, thinking they were being considerate. He probably intended to sit down and explain everything to you when the time was right. Death has a way of interrupting those plans. The truth of his words hit me hard. Edmund had always handled our investments, our insurance, our financial planning. He had mentioned several times in his last months that we needed to go over some things together. But there had always been doctor's appointments and treatments and the daily business of fighting his illness. We had run out of time. What do I do now? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Now, Mrs. Hartwell, you take control of your life. You have the resources to live anywhere you want, to do anything you want. The question is, what do you want? I thought about that question as we walked back to the house. What did I want? For months I had been so focused on being grateful for Daniel and Patricia's reluctant hospitality that I had forgotten I was allowed to want things for myself. I want to go home, I said suddenly. I want to live in my own house again. I want to wake up in the bedroom I shared with Edmund and have my coffee in the kitchen where we ate breakfast together for 40 years. Then that's what you should do. But Daniel and Patricia will think I'm being unreasonable. They've been telling me for months that I can't afford to maintain the house, that I need to be practical. Richard stopped walking and turned to face me. Mrs. Hartwell, with the value of this car collection alone, you could maintain that house for the rest of your life, and have money left over to travel the world if you wanted to. The only question is whether you want to sell the cars, or keep them as an investment. We had reached Richard's Bentley, and I could see Daniel's car parked across the street. He had been waiting there, watching, probably wondering who this well-dressed stranger was, and why I was taking so long. Mrs. Hartwell, I have a proposition for you. I'd like to help you get these cars properly appraised and authenticated. I know collectors who would pay premium prices for vehicles of this quality, but more than that, I'd like to help you understand exactly what your financial situation is. You shouldn't have to make important decisions based on incomplete information. That's very kind of you, but I'm not sure I can afford. My services in this matter would be complimentary. Your husband was clearly a craftsman of the highest order, and I consider it a privilege to handle his collection. Besides, he smiled, I have a feeling this is going to be a very profitable arrangement for both of us. Daniel had gotten out of his car, and was walking toward us, his expression a mixture of curiosity and impatience. I watched my son approach, and felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I was not the one who needed to explain herself. Mom, what's going on? I've been waiting for over 2 hours. Who is this? Richard extended his hand with smooth professionalism. Richard Blackwood, Premier Auto Collections. You must be Mrs. Hartwell's son. I was just discussing your mother's remarkable automobile collection with her. Daniel shook his hand, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Collection? Mom, we talked about this. Dad's old cars aren't worth much. They've been sitting in the garage for months. Actually, Richard said, his voice carefully neutral, your mother's collection is quite valuable. We're looking at well over $1 million in classic automobiles. I watched Daniel's face go through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and then something that looked almost like hunger. $1 million? Are you serious? Completely serious. Your mother owns some extraordinary vehicles. Daniel turned to look at me, and I saw him truly see me for the first time in months. Not as a burden or an obligation, but as a person of substance. Mom, why didn't you tell me they were worth that much? Because I didn't know, I said quietly. Your father never discussed the specific values with me. I could see Daniel's mind working, calculating, already making plans for money that wasn't his. Well, this changes everything. We need to sell them right away. Get the money invested properly. Mom, you could move into a really nice retirement community with that kind of money. Something cold settled in my stomach. Even faced with the knowledge that I was financially independent, Daniel's first thought was still about moving me out of my own home. Actually, I said, finding my voice, I think I'd like to move back into my own house. Mom, be reasonable. That house is too big for you, and the maintenance costs can be easily covered by the income from this collection. Richard interjected smoothly. Mrs. Hartwell has more than enough resources to live comfortably wherever she chooses. I looked at Richard, then at Daniel, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I want to go home. Tonight, I want to sleep in my own bed and wake up in my own house tomorrow morning. Daniel's face flushed red. Mom, you're being impulsive. We need to think this through, make plans. Patricia and I can help you manage the money. The money is mine, Daniel. The words came out more sharply than I intended, but I didn't regret them. And I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel looked like he had been slapped, and I realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as his mother, and started seeing me as a problem to be solved. Mrs. Hartwell, Richard said gently, would you like me to help you gather your belongings? I'd be happy to drive you home. The offer was like a lifeline. Yes, thank you. I don't have much here. As I walked toward Daniel's house, to collect my few possessions, I heard him talking to Richard in urgent low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. When I came back out with my small suitcase, Daniel approached me one more time. Mom, please don't do anything hasty. Let's at least talk about this tomorrow when we've all had time to think. I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt a sadness so deep it was like drowning. Daniel, you made me walk 3 blocks in a thunderstorm to save $3 in gas money. When I own cars worth over $1 million, what exactly is there to think about? He had no answer for that. Richard's Bentley felt like a sanctuary as we drove away from Daniel's house. I didn't look back. As we pulled into my driveway on Elm Street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Mrs. Hartwell, Richard said as he helped me with my suitcase. I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'll help you navigate the financial aspects, and I'll make sure you understand all your options before you make any decisions. Why? I asked. Why are you being so kind to me? He was quiet for a moment, looking up at the house that had been my home for so many years. Because I had a mother once who was treated poorly by people who should have protected her. I was too young then to do anything about it. I'm not too young anymore. As I unlocked my front door and stepped into the familiar warmth of my own home, I felt Edmund's presence everywhere. The smell of his pipe tobacco still lingered faintly in his study. His reading glasses still sat on the table beside his favorite chair. This was where I belonged, where I had always belonged. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in 8 months, and for the first time since Edmund's death, I slept peacefully. The next morning brought a new chapter in a story I thought was already over. But this chapter, I was determined, would be written on my own terms. The morning sun streaming through my bedroom windows felt like a blessing. I had forgotten how beautiful mornings could be in my own home, how the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air and made everything feel alive. It was Saturday, and for the first time in 8 months, I woke up without the weight of someone else's schedule pressing down on me. I made my coffee in the kitchen. Edmund and I had remodeled 15 years ago, using my favorite china cup instead of the chipped mug Daniel had insisted was practical for everyday use. The simple pleasure of choosing my own cup, drinking my coffee at my own pace, felt revolutionary after months of careful accommodation to other people's routines. Richard had called the night before to check on me and confirm our appointment for Monday morning. He was bringing a team of experts to conduct formal appraisals of Edmund's cars, and he had also arranged for me to meet with a financial advisor who specialized in sudden wealth management. The phrase sudden wealth still felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in magazine articles. As I sat at my kitchen table, I noticed the stack of mail Patricia had been collecting for me during my stay at Daniel's house. Most of it was routine bills and advertisements, but there were several official-looking envelopes that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I had been avoiding dealing with Edmund's estate paperwork, overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. The first envelope contained a letter from Edmund's insurance company regarding a life insurance policy I had forgotten existed. According to the letter, I was entitled to a death benefit of $250,000. But the claim had been sitting in limbo for months, because I had never submitted the required documentation. The second envelope was from his pension fund, informing me of survivor benefits that totaled nearly $3,000 per month for the rest of my life. By the time I finished reading through all the correspondence, I realized that even without the car collection, I was far from destitute. Edmund had been even more thorough in his planning than I had known. Between the life insurance, pension benefits, and our existing savings accounts, I had enough money to live comfortably for decades. The phone rang just as I was trying to process this new information. The caller ID showed Daniel's number, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but maternal instinct won out. "Hello, Daniel. Mom, thank God you answered. Patricia and I have been worried sick about you. We barely slept last night thinking about you alone in that big house." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but I found myself listening with new ears, hearing undertones I had missed before. "I slept very well, thank you. Mom, we need to talk. This whole situation with the cars, it's got us both confused. We had no idea Dad had left you so well off. Why didn't you tell us you had that kind of money?" "Because I didn't know, Daniel. As I explained yesterday, your father and I never discussed specific values." There was a pause, and I could hear Patricia's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. When Daniel spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "Look, Mom, we've been talking, and we think there might have been a misunderstanding yesterday. This car dealer, Richard, whatever his name is, he might be trying to take advantage of you. These guys are notorious for inflating values to make bigger commissions." The suggestion hit me like a slap. After months of being treated like I couldn't manage my own affairs, here was Daniel questioning the one person who had shown me genuine respect and kindness. "Richard is trying to help me, Daniel. He's been nothing but professional and considerate. Mom, you've known this guy for exactly 1 day. Patricia and I have been taking care of you for 8 months. Don't you think we deserve a little more trust than some stranger who's obviously trying to make money off you?" The manipulation in his words was so clear now that I wondered how I had missed it for so long. Everything was framed in terms of what Daniel and Patricia deserved, what they had done for me, how I owed them consideration for their sacrifices. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Yesterday, when you made me walk 3 blocks in the rain, what were you thinking?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, that's not fair. I was having a stressful day, and gas prices really are expensive right now." $3, Daniel. $3 in gas money to spare your elderly mother a walk in a thunderstorm. Even if I had been as poor as you seem to think, was $3 really worth my dignity? "It wasn't about the money, Mom. It was about you learning to be more independent. Patricia and I thought maybe if you had to do more things for yourself, you'd gain confidence." The excuse was so transparently false that I almost laughed. "By making me walk in the rain. We were trying to help you, Mom. Everything we've done has been trying to help you." I thought about that claim, really examined it for the first time. Had making me feel like a burden been helpful? Had the constant suggestions that I was becoming forgetful and incompetent been supportive? Had the pressure to sell my home and move into a facility been in my best interest? "Daniel, I think we have very different definitions of helpful." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel becoming increasingly agitated as I refused to agree that Richard was somehow scheming against me. By the time I hung up, I felt drained but also strangely clear-headed. The fog of self-doubt that had surrounded me for months was beginning to lift. That afternoon, I decided to drive to the grocery store. I hadn't been behind the wheel since moving in with Daniel and Patricia, partly because they had convinced me that my reflexes weren't what they used to be, and partly because they preferred to control when and where errands got done. My car, a reliable Honda Civic that Edmund had bought for me 3 years before his death, started immediately despite sitting unused for months. The drive to Millbrook Market felt like an adventure. I took the long way, past the library where I had volunteered for 10 years, past the church where Edmund and I had been married, past the park where we had taken Daniel when he was young. These were my streets, my landmarks, my life. How had I let myself believe that I didn't belong here anymore? At the grocery store, I ran into several people I hadn't seen since Edmund's funeral. Margaret Chen, who lived 2 streets over from me, approached with genuine warmth and concern. "Eleanor, I've been wondering how you've been doing. I heard you were staying with Daniel and his wife. How are you adjusting?" It was an innocent question the kind neighbors ask out of caring, but it made me realize how isolated I had become. "Actually, Margaret, I moved back home yesterday. I'm doing much better now." Her face lit up. "Oh, that's wonderful. I know how much that house means to you. James and I were just saying the other day that it would be such a shame if you had to sell it. Your garden was always the most beautiful on the street." My garden. I hadn't thought about my garden in months. Edmund and I had spent countless hours together among the roses and perennials, and I had simply abandoned it when grief overwhelmed me. Another piece of my identity that I had let slip away. "I should get back to gardening," I said, more to myself than to Margaret. "You absolutely should. And Eleanor, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. James and I are right down the street, and we'd be happy to help however we can." The offer of help felt different coming from Margaret than it had from Daniel and Patricia. There was no underlying agenda, no sense that her kindness came with strings attached. This was what community looked like, what real support felt like. As I drove home with my groceries, I thought about the difference between being helped and being managed. Daniel and Patricia had managed me, making decisions for my own good, without consulting me, treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. Margaret, like Richard, had offered help while leaving me in control of my own choices. Sunday morning brought another revelation. I was reading the newspaper in Edmund's chair, something I had avoided doing during my months at Daniel's house, because it felt too painful. Today, it felt comforting rather than sad, like Edmund was still there beside me, still part of my daily routine. The real estate section caught my attention, specifically an article about classic car investments. According to the piece, vintage automobiles had been outperforming traditional investments for the past 5 years, with some rare models appreciating at rates of 15 to 20% annually. The article mentioned several specific makes and models that were particularly sought after, including Shelby Cobras and Rolls-Royce Silver Shadows. I thought about Richard's suggestion that I consider keeping the cars as investments rather than selling them immediately. With the insurance money and pension benefits I had discovered, I didn't need to sell anything right away. The cars could continue appreciating in value while providing me with financial security and a connection to Edmund's passion. The phone rang again around noon. This time it was Patricia, and her tone was markedly different from Daniel's concerned approach. "Eleanor, we need to discuss this situation like adults. Daniel is too emotional about this whole thing, because you're his mother, but I can see what's happening here more clearly." I felt my defenses go up immediately. Patricia had always been direct to the point of bluntness, but there was something in her voice that sounded almost predatory. "What situation, Patricia? This car dealer is obviously running some kind of scam. These inflated appraisals are a classic con game. They get elderly people excited about imaginary fortunes, then find ways to separate them from their real assets." The accusation was so similar to Daniel's that I suspected they had rehearsed this conversation. "What real assets, Patricia? Until yesterday, you were telling me I was practically destitute. That's not the point. The point is that you're being manipulated by a stranger who sees you as an easy target. Daniel and I have been trying to protect you from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. By making me feel like a burden, by pressuring me to sell my home and move into a facility. That was protection." Patricia's voice hardened. "Eleanor, you need to face facts. You're 72 years old, you've been dealing with depression since Edmund died, and you're clearly not thinking rationally about your situation. This fantasy about million-dollar cars is just another symptom of your inability to cope with reality." The words hit me like a physical blow. Patricia was suggesting that I was mentally incompetent, that my newfound knowledge about the cars was some kind of delusion brought on by grief and age. "The cars are real, Patricia. Richard is bringing professional appraisers tomorrow to document their value. Eleanor, listen to yourself. You met this man 1 day ago, and now you're ready to believe that you're suddenly wealthy. Doesn't that seem a little too convenient to you? For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I being naive? Was Richard too good to be true? But then I remembered the respect in his voice, when he talked about Edmund's work, the genuine concern he had shown for my well-being, the professional way he had conducted himself throughout our interactions. Patricia, I think this conversation is over. Don't hang up on me, Eleanor. We're trying to help you before you make a terrible mistake. The only mistake I made was letting you and Daniel convince me that I was helpless. I won't be making that mistake again. I hung up the phone and immediately turned off the ringer. Whatever happened tomorrow with the appraisals, I wasn't going to let Daniel and Patricia's negativity poison the experience. That evening, I called my sister Victoria in San Diego. Victoria was 5 years older than me, and had always been the more adventurous of us, traveling the world with her late husband and maintaining her independence well into her 70s. Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise. How are you holding up, sweetheart? Just hearing Victoria's voice made me feel stronger. I'm actually calling with some surprising news, Vic. It turns out Edmund left me better off than I thought. I told her the whole story, from the humiliating walk in the rain to the discovery of the car's value to the confrontations with Daniel and Patricia. Victoria listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or indignation. Eleanor, she said when I finished, I have to tell you, I've been worried about your living situation with Daniel. The few times we talked while you were staying there, you sounded so diminished, so unlike yourself. What do you mean? Remember when we were young, how you always stood up for yourself? When that teacher in high school tried to give you a lower grade, because you were a girl, you marched straight to the principal's office and fought it. When the bank tried to refuse you a loan for the house, because Edmund's signature wasn't enough, you sat in that manager's office until he approved it. You've never been the kind of person to just accept unfair treatment. I had forgotten those moments, forgotten the woman I used to be before grief and manipulation had worn me down. I feel like I lost myself somewhere along the way. Grief can do that, honey, but it sounds like you're finding your way back. This Richard person, he sounds like good people. Sometimes strangers can see us more clearly than family can. Daniel thinks Richard is trying to scam me. Victoria snorted. Daniel thinks anyone who doesn't agree with his assessment of your capabilities is a threat. Eleanor, can I ask you something? How much money has Daniel saved by having you live with them these past 8 months? I thought about it. My Social Security payments had been going directly into their household account to cover my expenses. I had been paying for my own food, medications, and personal items. I had even given Daniel money for gas and utilities several times when he mentioned how tight things were. Probably several $1,000s, I admitted. And now he finds out you're actually wealthy, and his first concern is that someone might be taking advantage of you. Eleanor, I think Daniel's real worry is that his free ride is coming to an end. The observation stung, because it rang true. Daniel and Patricia had benefited financially from my presence, despite their constant complaints about what a burden I was. My guilt about imposing on them had been completely misplaced. Victoria, what would you do in my situation? I'd trust my instincts. From everything you've told me, this Richard fellow has treated you with respect and kindness. Your own son made you walk in a rainstorm to save pocket change. Which one of those behaviors tells you more about character? We talked for another hour, and by the time I hung up, I felt like myself again for the first time in months. Victoria had reminded me that I wasn't helpless, that I wasn't a burden, that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for what I hoped would be a life-changing day. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the navy blue one I had worn to important occasions throughout my marriage. Looking in the mirror, I saw not a frail elderly woman who needed managing, but a composed lady who commanded respect. Richard arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, bringing with him 2 other professionals. One was a certified automotive appraiser named Stephen Walsh, a serious man in his 40s, who specialized in classic American muscle cars. The other was Dr. Patricia Hendricks, an art history professor, who had written extensively about automotive design and collected vintage vehicles herself. "Mrs. Hartwell," Richard said as I welcomed them into my home, "I want you to know that both Stephen and Dr. Hendricks are completely independent. They don't work for me, and they'll be providing their own separate appraisals. I want you to have complete confidence in whatever values they determine." The team spent the morning examining Edmund's cars with meticulous attention to detail. They photographed every surface, checked serial numbers, tested systems, and documented the condition of each vehicle with scientific precision. I watched from a distance, fascinated by their expertise and professionalism. Dr. Hendricks was particularly impressed with the Rolls-Royce. "Mrs. Hartwell, your husband's attention to detail was extraordinary. This isn't just a restoration, it's a preservation of automotive history. The care he took with the original materials, the accuracy of the color matching, the condition of the interior, it's museum-quality work." Stephen Walsh was equally enthusiastic about the Shelby Cobra. "This is one of the finest examples I've ever seen. The documentation your husband kept, the originality of the components, the quality of the restoration work, it's textbook perfect. Cars like this don't come on the market very often." As they worked, I found myself telling them stories about Edmund's restoration process, how he had spent months tracking down original parts, how he had taught himself upholstery work, to redo the interiors properly, how he had corresponded with other collectors around the world to verify authenticity details. "Your husband was a true craftsman," Dr. Hendricks said. "In the collector car world, provenance and documentation are everything." The fact that he kept such detailed records of his work adds significantly to these vehicles' value. By noon they had completed their examinations and were ready to discuss their findings. We gathered in my living room, and I felt my heart racing as Stephen opened his folder. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to start with the Plymouth Barracuda because it's the most straightforward valuation. This is a 1970 CUDA with the 440 six-pack engine, which is a highly desirable configuration. In this condition with this documentation, I would estimate its value at $65,000. The number was higher than Richard's initial estimate, and I felt a flutter of excitement. "The Shelby Cobra is more complex," Stephen continued. "This is a genuine 1965 427 Cobra, which puts it in the most valuable category of these cars. The restoration quality is exceptional, and the documentation is complete. My appraisal is $475,000. I had to grip the arms of my chair to steady myself. $475,000 for one car." Dr. Hendricks took over for the final appraisal. "Mrs. Hartwell, the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow is an interesting case. While these cars are generally less valuable than the Cobra, this particular example is extraordinary. The condition, the documentation, and the quality of your husband's work have created something truly special. My appraisal is $380,000. I did the math quickly in my head. $920,000. Nearly $1 million sitting in my garage, and I had been made to feel guilty about the cost of groceries. There's one more thing," Dr. Hendricks added. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'd like to feature your husband's work in an article I'm writing about master automotive restorers. With your permission, I'd like to photograph the cars and tell the story of his craftsmanship. This kind of recognition could add even more to their value over time." The morning had been overwhelming, but in the best possible way. As Richard and his team prepared to leave, I felt a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. "Mrs. Hartwell," Richard said as we stood by his car, "I want you to know that you have options. You can sell any or all of these cars whenever you choose, or you can keep them as investments. With proper insurance and storage, they'll likely continue appreciating in value. The choice is entirely yours. What would you recommend?" "Honestly, I'd recommend keeping them for now. You don't need the money immediately, and these are the kind of assets that become more valuable over time. But more than that, they're a connection to your husband's passion. Some things are worth more than money." As I watched them drive away, I felt like I was seeing my life clearly for the first time in months. I wasn't a burden, I wasn't helpless. I wasn't poor. I was a woman of considerable means with choices to make about her future. The phone started ringing before I had even closed the front door. This time it was Daniel, and his voice was tight with anxiety. "Mom, I drove by the house and saw cars leaving. Please tell me you didn't sign anything without talking to us first." "Hello to you too, Daniel. The appraisers just finished their work." "Appraisers, Mom, you should have waited for us to be there. We could have protected you from any high-pressure tactics." "There were no high-pressure tactics, Daniel. Just professional evaluations of your father's work." "And what did they say?" I paused, looking around my beautiful home, feeling the weight of my newfound knowledge. "They confirmed that the cars are worth over $900,000. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the connection had been lost. $900,000. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, your father was apparently even more skilled than any of us realized." "Mom, this is incredible news. Patricia and I need to come over right away so we can help you figure out what to do with all this money." The presumption in his statement was breathtaking. Even faced with proof of my financial independence, Daniel's first instinct was still to manage me. "Daniel, I think I can figure out what to do with my own money." "Mom, don't be ridiculous. This is serious money, the kind that requires professional management. You can't just leave it sitting around." "I'm not leaving it sitting around. I'm keeping it in the form of appreciating assets, exactly where your father intended it to be." Another long pause. "You're not selling the cars?" "Not right now, no." "Mom, that's crazy. You need to diversify your investments. Put the money in proper financial instruments. Keeping it all in old cars is way too risky." I almost laughed at the irony. For months Daniel had been telling me I was too poor to maintain my lifestyle. Now that he knew I was wealthy, I was suddenly too rich to manage my own money. "Daniel, I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision." "Then at least let us help you find a good financial advisor. Patricia knows someone at her bank who specializes in estate planning." "I already have a financial advisor. Richard is arranging for me to meet with someone who specializes in sudden wealth management." "You're trusting this car dealer to choose your financial advisor too." "Mom, you're making decisions way too fast. You need to slow down and think this through rationally." The word rationally triggered something in me. It was the same language Patricia had used, the same implication that my judgment couldn't be trusted. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. If these cars had been worthless, what would you and Patricia have wanted me to do?" "What do you mean? If the appraisers had said they were only worth a few $1,000s, what would your advice have been about my future?" Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard everything I needed to know. "We would have still wanted what's best for you, Mom." "Which would have been what specifically?" "Well, you'd still need to think about downsizing, maybe looking into some kind of assisted living situation. The house is still too big for you, and you'd still need help managing your day-to-day affairs." There it was. The plan hadn't changed at all. Whether I was poor or rich, Daniel and Patricia still saw me as someone who needed to be managed, controlled, moved out of my own home, and into a situation where they could oversee my life. But now that I'm financially independent, that's no longer necessary, is it? Money doesn't solve everything, Mom. You're still alone in that big house, and you're still dealing with grief and depression. Having money doesn't automatically make you capable of living independently. The judgment in his voice was clear, and I realized that this had never really been about money at all. It had been about power, about Daniel and Patricia's belief that they knew better than I did what was good for me. "Daniel, I think we should take a break from this conversation. I need some time to process everything that's happened today." "Mom, please don't shut us out. We're your family, we love you and we want to help." "Then respect my decisions. Respect my ability to make choices about my own life." "We do respect you, Mom. But love sometimes means protecting people from their own poor judgment." And there it was. The core of the problem laid bare. Daniel didn't respect me at all. He saw me as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose decisions needed to be overruled by people who knew better. Goodbye, Daniel. I hung up the phone and immediately unplugged it from the wall. I had spent 8 months listening to other people tell me what I could and couldn't do, what I should and shouldn't want, who I was and wasn't capable of being. That phase of my life was over. Standing in my living room, surrounded by the life Edmund and I had built together, I felt something I hadn't experienced since his death. Excitement about the future. I had choices to make, possibilities to explore, a life to reclaim. The woman who had been made to walk in the rain to save $3 was gone. In her place stood someone I was just beginning to remember. Eleanor Hartwell, a woman of substance, who deserved respect and dignity, and the right to determine her own destiny. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had given me something invaluable, the knowledge that I was not helpless, not a burden, and definitely not alone. Richard had shown me that there were people in the world who could see my worth without trying to diminish it. As afternoon sunlight filled my beautiful home, I began to make plans for a future that was entirely my own. Wednesday morning brought a knock on my door that changed everything. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard the sharp rap of knuckles against wood. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a business suit holding an official-looking folder. My heart sank, wondering if somehow Daniel had found a way to involve social services or some other authority in his campaign to control my life. The woman introduced herself as Linda Morrison, a social worker from the county's Adult Protective Services Division. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes but a serious expression that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm here because we received a report expressing concern about your welfare and living situation. May I come in so we can discuss this privately?" The word report hit me like a physical blow. Someone had called the authorities about me, painting me as an elderly woman in need of intervention. I didn't need to guess who had made that call. "Of course, please come in." I led her to the living room, my hands trembling slightly as I offered her coffee. Linda settled into the chair across from me and opened her folder. "Mrs. Hartwell, we received information suggesting that you may be the victim of financial exploitation. The caller indicated that you're making impulsive decisions about significant assets and may be under the influence of someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart." The clinical language couldn't hide what was really happening. Daniel and Patricia had tried to have me declared incompetent or vulnerable, probably hoping that social services would step in and validate their concerns about my ability to manage my own affairs. "Who made this report, Miss Morrison?" "I can't share specific details about the reporting party, but I can tell you that the person who called claimed to be a concerned family member who has been caring for you since your husband's death." I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. This was exactly the kind of situation I had feared, where my own family's assessment of my capabilities would be given more weight than my actual behavior and choices. "Miss Morrison, may I ask what specific concerns were raised?" She consulted her notes. "The report indicated that you've been living with family members who have been providing care and support, that you recently moved out abruptly after meeting with someone who may be exploiting your grief and vulnerability, and that you're making major financial decisions without proper consideration or family input." Each word felt like another nail in a coffin being built around my independence. The way the situation was framed made me sound like a confused elderly woman being manipulated by predators, rather than a competent adult making informed decisions about her own life. "Miss Morrison, I understand that you have to investigate these reports, but I want you to know that I am not being exploited or manipulated. I recently discovered that my late husband left me more financially secure than I realized, and I've chosen to move back into my own home and take control of my own affairs." Linda nodded, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. How many times had she heard similar protestations from elderly people who were indeed being taken advantage of? "Mrs. Hartwell, would you mind if I ask you some questions about your recent activities and decisions? I need to assess your understanding of your situation and your capacity to make these kinds of choices." For the next hour, Linda subjected me to what felt like an interrogation disguised as a wellness check. She asked about my mental health, my understanding of financial matters, my relationship with Daniel and Patricia, and my recent interactions with Richard. Every question felt like a trap, designed to reveal some deficiency in my judgment or understanding. I answered each question carefully and completely, explaining the timeline of events, the professional appraisals of Edmund's cars, my discovery of insurance benefits and pension payments, and my decision to reclaim my independence. Throughout the interview, Linda took detailed notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that suggested she was trying to determine whether I was mentally competent. Mrs. Hartwell, the reporting party expressed particular concern about your relationship with someone named Richard Blackwood. Can you tell me about your interactions with him? I explained how I had contacted Premier Auto Collections, how Richard had treated me with respect and professionalism, and how he had helped me understand the true value of Edmund's collection. I mentioned the independent appraisers he had brought in, and the financial advisor he was arranging for me to meet. Have you given Mr. Blackwood any money or signed any documents transferring assets to him? No, absolutely not. Richard has been completely transparent about his services, and has repeatedly emphasized that all decisions are mine to make. Linda made more notes, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask this directly. Do you believe you're mentally competent to make major financial decisions? Do you feel like you're thinking clearly about your situation? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. This was the moment where everything could change, where my answer could determine whether I retained control over my own life, or found myself subject to court-appointed guardianship. Miss Morrison, I am 72 years old, not senile. I have been married for 51 years, raised a son, managed a household, volunteered in my community, and helped my husband build a successful life together. The idea that I would suddenly become incompetent simply because I'm grieving or because I've made decisions my son disagrees with is insulting. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her, because Linda's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Hartwell, I understand your frustration. Unfortunately, elder abuse and financial exploitation are very real problems, and family members are often the perpetrators. We have to take these reports seriously. I appreciate that, but in this case the concern is misplaced. The person who called you has been pressuring me for months to sell my home and move into a facility. When I discovered that I actually have the financial resources to live independently, that person became even more insistent that I needed management and oversight. Linda closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Hartwell, based on our conversation today, I don't see any evidence of cognitive impairment or exploitation. You seem to have a clear understanding of your situation and the decisions you've made. However, I do need to document my findings, and may need to follow up with some of the people involved in your recent decisions. The implication was clear. She would be contacting Richard, probably Daniel and Patricia as well, and possibly the appraisers who had evaluated Edmund's cars. While I was confident that Richard would represent our interactions accurately, I worried about what narrative Daniel might present. Miss Morrison, may I ask what happens if family members continue to express concerns about my competency? If there were ongoing reports suggesting exploitation or impairment, we might need to involve the court system. In extreme cases, that could mean a competency hearing or the appointment of a guardian. But honestly, Mrs. Hartwell, based on what I've observed today, I don't think that's likely to be necessary. After Linda left, I sat in my living room feeling violated and exhausted. The idea that my own son had tried to use the legal system to override my autonomy was almost too painful to process. It also made me realize how precarious my situation really was. If Daniel and Patricia were persistent enough, they might be able to create enough official concern to threaten my independence. The phone rang an hour later, and I was surprised to hear Richard's voice on the other end. Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I just had a very interesting conversation with a social worker named Linda Morrison. She was asking questions about our business relationship and your recent decisions. My heart sank. Richard, I'm so sorry you got dragged into this. My son and his wife called Adult Protective Services and suggested that you might be taking advantage of me. There was a long pause before Richard responded, and when he did, his voice was carefully controlled. Mrs. Hartwell, in 30 years of business, I have never had anyone question my professional integrity in quite this way. I'm not angry with you, of course, but I am concerned about what this suggests about your family's approach to your independence. What did you tell the social worker? I told her the truth, that you contacted me seeking professional services, that I provided those services in a completely transparent manner, that I brought in independent appraisers to verify all valuations, and that at no point did you seem anything other than completely competent and rational. I felt a wave of gratitude toward this man who barely knew me but was willing to defend my reputation and autonomy. Richard, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. I understand if this situation makes you uncomfortable about continuing to work with me. Mrs. Hartwell, if anything, this situation makes me more committed to helping you protect your independence. What your family is trying to do to you is unconscionable. His words were like a lifeline. What do you think I should do? I think you need legal representation. Not just for estate planning, but for protection against future attempts to have your competency questioned. I know an excellent attorney who specializes in elder law and civil rights. Her name is Janet Williams, and she's helped other clients in similar situations. That afternoon, I found myself sitting in Janet Williams' law office, telling my story yet again to another professional, who would judge my competency and credibility. Janet was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her office was filled with law books and family photos, creating an atmosphere that was both authoritative and welcoming. Mrs. Hartwell, Janet said after listening to my account, what you're describing is a form of psychological abuse that's unfortunately common in families dealing with aging relatives. The systematic undermining of your confidence, the pressure to make decisions that benefit others at your expense, the attempt to involve authorities when you assert your independence. These are all classic patterns. Hearing my experience labeled as abuse was both validating and disturbing. I had been so focused on being grateful for Daniel and Patricia's reluctant help that I hadn't recognized the harmful nature of their behavior. What concerns me most, Janet continued, is the Adult Protective Services report. While Ms. Morrison seems to have concluded that you're competent, the fact that this report exists creates a paper trail that could be used against you in future legal proceedings. What kind of legal proceedings? If your son were to petition for guardianship, the APS report would be evidence he could present to support his case. Even though the investigation found no evidence of impairment, the mere fact that concerns were raised might influence a judge who doesn't know you personally. The thought of standing in a courtroom while Daniel argued that I was too incompetent to manage my own life made me feel sick. Janet, what can I do to protect myself? Several things. First, we're going to document your competency thoroughly. I'll arrange for you to undergo comprehensive cognitive testing by a geriatric psychiatrist. This will create an official record of your mental acuity that can be used to counter any future claims of impairment. She pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Second, we're going to review all of your legal documents to make sure they reflect your current wishes and protect your autonomy. That includes your will, any power of attorney documents, and healthcare directives. Edmund and I did all of that years ago. Circumstances change, Mrs. Hartwell. Documents that made sense when you were married and healthy might not serve your interests now that you're widowed and dealing with family conflict. Janet spent the next hour explaining various legal protections available to me. She talked about revocable living trusts that could protect my assets from interference, healthcare directives that would prevent unwanted medical decisions, and even restraining orders if Daniel and Patricia's harassment escalated. Mrs. Hartwell, I want to be clear about something. You have every right to live your life on your own terms. You have every right to choose who you associate with, how you spend your money, and where you live. No one, including family members, has the right to override those choices simply because they disagree with them. Her words were like a declaration of independence, and I felt tears of relief beginning to form. There's one more thing we should discuss, Janet continued. Given the value of your assets and the apparent conflict with your family, you might want to consider changing your will and other beneficiary designations. The suggestion shocked me. You mean disinherit Daniel? Not necessarily, but you might want to reconsider how your estate is structured. If Daniel believes he's entitled to control your assets now, how do you think he'll behave after you're gone? There are ways to provide for family members while also protecting your legacy and ensuring your wishes are respected. I left Janet's office with a thick folder of information and appointments scheduled for the following week. The cognitive testing she had arranged would take most of a day, but it would provide official documentation of my mental competency that no one could question. That evening, I called Victoria to update her on the day's events. My sister listened with growing indignation as I described the APS visit and my meeting with Janet Williams. Eleanor, I am so proud of you for standing up to this nonsense. But I'm also furious that Daniel would stoop to involving social services. That boy has lost his mind. Vic, I keep wondering if I'm being unreasonable. Maybe I should try to work things out with them, find some kind of compromise. Eleanor Hartwell, listen to me very carefully. You have done nothing wrong. You are not required to compromise your independence to make other people comfortable. Daniel and Patricia had you convinced that you were a burden when you were actually an asset. Now they're trying to convince you that you're incompetent when you're actually making the smartest decisions of your life. Victoria's words crystallized something that had been forming in my mind for days. This wasn't really about money or competency or even my well-being. It was about power and control, about Daniel and Patricia's belief that they had the right to determine how I lived my life. What would you do, Vic? I'd fight. I'd use every resource at my disposal to protect my independence and my dignity. And if family members couldn't accept my right to make my own choices, I'd find new family among people who respected me. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I was going to stop trying to preserve a relationship with Daniel and Patricia that was built on their denial of my autonomy. Instead, I was going to focus on building a life surrounded by people who saw me as a whole person deserving of respect. The next morning brought another surprise. I was in the garden attempting to salvage some of the perennials I had neglected during my months away when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Looking up, I saw Daniel getting out of his sedan, but this time he wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit followed him toward my front door. I met them on the porch, my gardening gloves still on my hands and dirt under my fingernails. The stranger was probably 60, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested money and influence. Mom, this is Lawrence Fitzgerald. He's a lawyer who specializes in estate planning and elder care issues. I asked him to come talk to you about protecting your assets. The presumption took my breath away. Daniel had brought a lawyer to my home without my permission, apparently expecting me to simply go along with whatever plan they had devised. Mr. Fitzgerald, I said politely, I appreciate you taking the time to come here, but I already have legal representation. Lawrence smiled with the kind of professional charm that immediately put me on guard. Hartwell, I understand you've been getting advice from various sources, but Daniel thought it would be helpful for you to hear from someone with extensive experience in protecting elderly clients from financial predators. The language was almost identical to what Daniel had been saying for days, and I realized this meeting had been carefully orchestrated. I'm not elderly in the sense you mean, Mr. Fitzgerald, and I'm not being preyed upon by anyone. Of course not, Mrs. Hartwell. But at your age, with assets of this magnitude, it's important to have proper safeguards in place. Daniel tells me you've been dealing with some car dealers who may have inflated the values of your vehicles to encourage hasty decisions. I looked at Daniel, standing beside this stranger he had brought into my life without permission, and felt something inside me harden. Mr. Fitzgerald, I had my cars appraised by independent professionals who don't work for any dealer. The valuations have been confirmed by multiple experts. I'm sure they have, Mrs. Hartwell, but the issue isn't whether the cars are valuable. The issue is whether keeping that much wealth in illiquid assets is the best strategy for someone in your position. And what position is that? Lawrence glanced at Daniel before answering. Someone who is dealing with grief, living alone, and facing the natural cognitive changes that come with aging. These factors can make even intelligent people vulnerable to poor financial decisions. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Here was another stranger, brought to my home by my own son, telling me that I was too old and too grief-stricken to manage my own money. Mr. Fitzgerald, I think this conversation is over. Mrs. Hartwell, please don't dismiss this advice without consideration. Daniel is genuinely concerned about your welfare, and I've seen too many elderly people make decisions they later regret because they didn't have proper guidance. The only decision I regret is allowing other people to convince me that I needed their guidance in the first place. Daniel stepped forward, his face flushed with frustration. Mom, you're being stubborn and unreasonable. We're trying to help you protect yourself from making mistakes that could cost you everything. Daniel, the only mistake I made was trusting you to have my best interests at heart. The words hung in the air between us, and I saw something change in Daniel's expression. The mask of concerned son slipped, revealing something much uglier underneath. Fine, Mom, if you want to be manipulated by strangers and throw away everything Dad worked for, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you realize you've been played. I won't be coming to you for anything, Daniel. Not anymore. Lawrence tried to salvage the situation. Mrs. Hartwell, family disputes can often be resolved through mediation. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting with all parties present to discuss everyone's concerns. There's nothing to mediate, Mr. Fitzgerald. This is my life, my money, and my decision. Daniel forfeited his right to have input when he called social services to have me declared incompetent. Both men looked surprised that I knew about the APS report, and I realized Daniel had probably thought I wouldn't figure out who had made the call. You called APS? Lawrence asked Daniel, his professional composure slipping slightly. We were concerned about her mental state. Daniel replied defensively. She was making impulsive decisions and refusing to listen to reason. Mr. Fitzgerald, I said calmly, I was evaluated by Adult Protective Services yesterday. They found no evidence of cognitive impairment or exploitation. I am a competent adult making informed decisions about my own life. Lawrence closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. Daniel, I think perhaps we should reconsider our approach here. Mrs. Hartwell clearly has strong feelings about maintaining her independence. She's being influenced by people who are taking advantage of her grief. Daniel insisted, this car dealer has her convinced that she's some kind of millionaire. I am some kind of millionaire, Daniel. The question is why that fact upsets you so much. For a moment Daniel looked like he might say something he would regret. Then he turned and walked toward his car without another word. Lawrence followed, shaking his head and muttering something about difficult family dynamics. As I watched them drive away, I felt a sense of liberation that was almost intoxicating. For months, I had been walking on eggshells, trying to accommodate other people's opinions about my life. Today I had finally said what I really thought, and the world hadn't ended. That afternoon, Richard called to check on me. Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you holding up? Yesterday's events with the social worker must have been stressful. Actually, Richard, I'm feeling stronger than I have in months. I met with an attorney today, who's going to help me protect my legal rights, and I think I'm finally ready to start planning for the future. I'm glad to hear that. Actually, I have some news that might interest you. I've been in contact with several collectors who have expressed serious interest in your husband's work, not to purchase the cars, but to feature them in exhibitions and publications. The idea intrigued me. What kind of exhibitions? There's a classic car show in Monterey next summer that would love to display the Shelby Cobra, and the Museum of Automotive History has asked about borrowing the Rolls-Royce for a special exhibition on restoration craftsmanship. I thought about Edmund, how proud he would have been to see his work recognized and celebrated. That sounds wonderful, Richard. I'd like to learn more about those opportunities. I'll send you the details. Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you know that regardless of what happens with your family situation, you have people who support you and respect your choices. As evening approached, I sat in Edmund's chair reading the information Janet Williams had given me about protecting my legal rights. The cognitive testing was scheduled for Monday, and I felt confident about the results. More importantly, I felt confident about myself. The phone rang one more time, and I saw Daniel's number on the caller ID. This time I didn't hesitate to let it go to voicemail. Whatever he had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. I had spent enough time listening to other people tell me what I should think, feel, and do. Instead, I called the florist and ordered flowers for Edmund's grave. It had been too long since I had visited him, and I wanted to tell him about everything that had happened. I wanted to thank him for the protections he had built into our legal documents, for the cars that had become my salvation, and for 51 years of treating me like a partner rather than a burden. As I prepared for bed in my own house, in my own room, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. A week ago, I had been a woman without options, dependent on reluctant family members and convinced of my own inadequacy. Tonight, I was a woman of means with choices to make, and a future to plan. The transformation hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time since Edmund's death, I felt like myself again. I felt capable, valuable, and free to determine my own destiny. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, but tonight, I was simply grateful to be home. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming showroom of the Monterey Classic Car Exhibition, watching strangers admire Edmund's 1965 Shelby Cobra. The placard beside the car read "On loan from the Edmund Hartwell Memorial Collection," and I felt a pride so deep it brought tears to my eyes. This was how Edmund's work deserved to be seen, celebrated and respected by people who understood its true value. The cognitive testing Janet had arranged had gone exactly as expected. Dr. Sarah Chen, the geriatric psychiatrist who conducted the evaluation, had been impressed by my mental acuity and emotional resilience. Her report, now part of my legal file, stated unequivocally that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, depression, or diminished capacity. Any future attempts to question my competency would have to overcome substantial professional evidence to the contrary. My new financial advisor, Catherine Mills, had helped me structure my assets in ways that protected both my independence and my legacy. The cars remained in my possession, but were now part of a carefully constructed trust that would preserve them regardless of what happened to me. The insurance money and pension benefits provided more than enough income for my daily needs, and the appreciating value of the collection ensured my long-term security. Richard approached me as I stood admiring the Cobra, a glass of champagne in his hand, and a satisfied smile on his face. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to say, your husband's work is the star of this exhibition. I've had 3 collectors ask me if you might consider selling, and 2 museums have inquired about future loans. And what did you tell them? That the owner is a very intelligent woman who makes her own decisions about her assets." I laughed, remembering how revolutionary that concept had seemed just months ago. "Richard, I need to thank you again for everything you've done for me. You gave me back my sense of worth when I desperately needed it." "Mrs. Hartwell, I think you give me too much credit. You found your own strength. I just provided some information and support along the way." The exhibition opening was crowded with collectors, museum curators, and automotive enthusiasts from around the world. Several people approached me throughout the evening to compliment Edmund's craftsmanship and to share their own stories about classic car restoration. I found myself engaged in conversations about automotive history, investment strategies, and preservation techniques, topics I had never imagined myself discussing with confidence. Near the end of the evening, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of my vision. Daniel stood near the entrance, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, and clearly out of place among the well-dressed collectors. He had been trying to contact me for weeks, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading, but I had maintained my boundaries and refused to engage. Now, seeing him in person for the first time since that disastrous confrontation at my house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. The hurt and anger were still there, but underneath them was something I hadn't expected: pity. He looked older, more worn than I remembered, and there was something desperate in his eyes as he scanned the room looking for me. Richard noticed him too. "Mrs. Hartwell, would you like me to handle this situation?" "No, thank you, Richard. I think it's time Daniel and I had a conversation." I walked across the showroom, my heels clicking on the polished marble floor, feeling more confident and self-possessed than I had in years. Daniel saw me coming and straightened his shoulders, but I could see the uncertainty in his posture. "Hello, Daniel." "Mom." His voice was quiet, almost subdued. "You look good, happy." "I am happy. What are you doing here?" He gestured vaguely at the exhibition around us. "I heard about this from Margaret Chen. She mentioned that Dad's cars were being displayed. I wanted to see them." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the elegant crowd and the gleaming automobiles, 2 people who had once been family, trying to find common ground across a gulf of hurt and misunderstanding. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Patricia and I are getting divorced." The news surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The financial pressure that had driven so much of their behavior toward me had probably affected their marriage in other ways as well. "I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel. Are you, really?" There was a bitter edge to his voice. "I thought you'd be happy to see us fall apart after everything that happened." I studied my son's face, seeing the boy I had raised buried somewhere beneath the anger and disappointment. "Daniel, I never wanted you to be unhappy. I just wanted you to treat me with respect." I know that now." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with something difficult. Mom, I've been going to counseling since Patricia and I separated, trying to understand how everything went so wrong. The admission surprised me. Daniel had always been resistant to the idea of therapy, viewing it as a weakness rather than a tool for growth. What have you learned? That I was an ass, that I let financial stress and Patricia's influence turn me into someone I don't recognize. That I treated you like a burden, when you were the one person who had always been there for me. His words carried the weight of genuine remorse, but I found myself listening carefully for the sincerity behind them. Months of manipulation had taught me to be cautious about emotional appeals. Daniel, I appreciate you acknowledging that, but apologies don't erase what happened. You tried to have me declared incompetent. You brought a stranger to my home to override my decisions. You made me feel worthless and unwanted. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. Maybe not ever, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and I'm trying to become a better person. We walked slowly through the exhibition, past cars that represented decades of craftsmanship and passion. Daniel stopped in front of the Rolls-Royce, his father's masterpiece, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. He would have been so proud of this, Daniel said softly. Dad always said his work would outlast him, but I never really understood what he meant until now. Your father spent 5 years restoring that car. Every detail was researched and perfected. He used to say that true craftsmanship was about creating something beautiful that would bring joy to people long after you were gone, like what you're doing now, sharing his work with people who can appreciate it. I looked at Daniel, trying to gauge whether this new understanding was genuine, or another attempt at manipulation, but there was something different in his demeanor, a humility that hadn't been there before. Mom, I know I don't have any right to ask this, but would you consider having dinner with me sometime? Not to talk about money, or living arrangements, or any of that, just to talk, maybe to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. The request hung between us, loaded with history and hurt. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries that had protected me over these past months, but another part of me, the part that remembered holding him as a baby and cheering at his baseball games, wanted to believe that redemption was possible. Daniel, I'm willing to consider it, but there would have to be conditions. Whatever you want. No discussions about my finances, my living situation, or my decision-making capacity. No suggestions about what I should or shouldn't do with my money. No attempts to involve Patricia, or lawyers or social workers in my life. And if you revert to treating me like an incompetent child who needs managing, the conversation ends permanently. He nodded immediately. I understand. And Mom, I want you to know that I'm genuinely proud of how you handled everything. It took courage to stand up to us and reclaim your independence. I should have been supporting you instead of trying to control you. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, I found myself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship with Daniel. It would never be the same as it had been before, and trust would take time to rebuild, but perhaps it wasn't entirely hopeless. Richard approached as I was preparing to leave. Mrs. Hartwell, I wanted to let you know that the Museum of Automotive History has made a formal request to feature your collection in a permanent exhibition about restoration craftsmanship. It would be quite an honor for your husband's work. The opportunity excited me. What would that involve? They would display one or more of the cars on a rotating basis, with detailed information about your husband's restoration process and techniques. It would be educational as well as aesthetic, inspiring future generations of craftsmen. I thought about Edmund, about how much he had valued teaching and sharing knowledge. This seemed like a perfect way to honor his legacy, while ensuring that his skills and passion wouldn't be forgotten. I'd like to learn more about that opportunity, Richard. As I drove home that night, windows down and the warm California air flowing through my car, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. 6 months ago, I had been a woman without options, convinced of my own inadequacy and dependent on others for basic decisions. Tonight, I was returning from an international exhibition where my late husband's work was celebrated, where I had been treated as a person of substance and respect. The house on Elm Street welcomed me home with warm lights and familiar comfort. I had redecorated some of the rooms, making them more suited to my tastes now that I didn't have to accommodate anyone else's preferences. The guest room that had once felt like a prison when I was staying with Daniel was now a bright studio where I had begun painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago, but was rediscovering with joy. My new life was fuller and richer than I had imagined possible. Catherine, my financial advisor, had become a friend as well as a professional colleague. Janet Williams and I met regularly to discuss not just legal protections but also philanthropic opportunities. I had established a small foundation to help other elderly people facing family manipulation, and we were already making a difference in several lives. The loneliness I had feared would consume me had been replaced by meaningful connections with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. Margaret Chen and her husband James had become regular dinner companions. Victoria visited more frequently now that I was happier and more engaged with life. Even some of Daniel's old friends had reached out, expressing regret that they hadn't realized what was happening and offering their support. But perhaps the most surprising development was my relationship with Richard. What had begun as a professional interaction had evolved into something deeper. He was intelligent, kind, and treated me as an equal in all our dealings. When he had asked if I might be interested in attending classical music concerts with him, I had been surprised by how readily I had said yes. At our age, he had said with a smile, life is too short to waste time wondering about propriety. If we enjoy each other's company, why shouldn't we explore that? The relationship was taking its time to develop, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than need or convenience. After 51 years of marriage to Edmund, I had never imagined I might find companionship again, but Richard's presence in my life felt natural and comfortable. 3 weeks later, Daniel and I met for dinner at a quiet restaurant in downtown Millbrook. He arrived on time, dressed nicely but not formally, and his demeanor was respectful without being obsequious. Throughout the meal, he kept his promise to avoid discussing my finances or living situation, instead asking about my painting, my volunteer work with the foundation, and my memories of his father. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what Dad would say about everything that happened between us. What do you think he would say? That he raised me better than I behaved. That treating you like a burden was the opposite of everything he taught me about family and respect. I could hear Edmund's voice in those words, and I knew Daniel was right. Your father always said that character is revealed not in good times, but in how we treat people when we're stressed or frightened. I failed that test completely, but Mom, I want you to know that I'm working on becoming the kind of man Dad would be proud of. The kind of son you deserve. The conversation continued for 2 hours, and while it didn't erase the months of hurt and betrayal, it felt like the beginning of something new. Daniel asked thoughtful questions about my life now, expressed genuine interest in my philanthropic work, and shared his own struggles with rebuilding his life after the divorce. As we prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door of the restaurant. Mom, would it be all right if I called you next week? Not to ask for anything, or to offer advice, just to check in and see how you're doing. I think that would be fine, Daniel. And Mom, thank you for giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for it. Driving home that night, I thought about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between rebuilding a relationship and returning to old patterns. Daniel might genuinely be changing, or this might be another more subtle form of manipulation. Only time would tell, but I felt confident in my ability to maintain my boundaries regardless of how things developed. A year after that rainy day, when Daniel had made me walk 3 blocks to save gas money, I stood in the same spot where Richard's Bentley had first pulled up to rescue me from the storm. The contrast between that desperate, humiliated woman and the person I had become was almost impossible to believe. The cars that had changed everything were still in my garage, still appreciating in value, still connecting me to Edmund's passion and legacy, but they were no longer symbols of hidden worth or secret assets. They were simply part of a life I had learned to live on my own terms. Richard pulled into the driveway, arriving to pick me up for a weekend trip to Napa Valley. We were going to visit some vintage car collectors he knew, and I was looking forward to learning about their restoration projects, and perhaps finding new pieces for future exhibitions. As I locked my front door and walked toward his car, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was confident, well-dressed, and genuinely happy. She bore little resemblance to the broken widow, who had once been grateful for scraps of reluctant kindness from ungrateful family members. "Ready for an adventure, Eleanor?" Richard asked as he held the car door open for me. "I'm ready for anything," I replied, and for the first time in my life, I truly meant it. The road ahead stretched out before us, full of possibilities and promise. Behind us, the house on Elm Street stood solid and welcoming, a symbol of independence reclaimed and dignity restored. Whatever challenges the future might bring, I would meet them as myself, strong and free and worthy of respect. The rain that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of the life I was meant to live. Sometimes it takes a storm to wash away the illusions that keep us small, revealing the truth of who we really are beneath the fears and doubts others have imposed upon us. I had learned that worth isn't something that diminishes with age or grief. It isn't something that others can take away, or that requires their permission to claim. It's something that lives inside us, waiting for the moment we're brave enough to remember who we've always been. As Richard's car pulled away from the curb, and we headed toward our next adventure, I smiled at the thought of that soaked, humiliated woman, who had stumbled into Premier Auto Collections so many months ago. She couldn't have imagined the journey that lay ahead of her, the strength she would discover, or the life she would ultimately claim. But she had taken that first step into the storm, and sometimes that's all the courage we need to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.